My daughter-in-law called me dead weight, right in front of my grandchildren. So I smiled, stood up from her perfect kitchen table, and quietly pulled the rope that held up their entire lifestyle. No more tuition, no more mortgage, no more rescue. I'd co-signed every dream they claimed as their own. Now they'll learn what gravity feels like without my name holding them up. And the silence I left behind? It's finally louder than their entitlement. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Diane's slippers made a soft hush against the hardwood as she carried a folded blanket toward the living room. Then she heard it, Jason's voice, low but distinct, drifting out from his office down the hall. She almost called out to ask if he wanted tea, but something in his tone stopped her. She's just a monthly expense now. The words cut through the air, flat and sharp as a blade. Diane froze mid-step, blanket slipping from her arms, landing soundlessly on the floor. The world around her seemed to contract, walls closing in, air turning cold. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Jason's voice came again, muffled but unmistakable. We need to tighten things. Her meds, her house, maybe sell sooner. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Taryn. Diane recognized the faint tinny laughter from the speakerphone, a sound she'd grown to dread. Diane's stomach twisted. The edges of the hallway blurred, her vision narrowing until all she could see was the faint glow spilling under Jason's office door. Her mind tried to rewrite what she'd heard, to soften it, but the words replayed, unyielding. She turned slowly, her body moving on instinct. Down the hall, through the kitchen, every step seemed to echo. The clock ticked louder, the refrigerator hummed. The life she'd built, the dinners, the mortgages, the compromises, felt like a set of props on a stage where she'd already been written out of the script. At the counter, her hand found the light switch. She pressed it. The bulb above flickered once, then went black. The darkness wrapped around her like a blanket. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing in the stillness, listening to the faint murmur of Jason's voice from down the hall. The dark felt safer than the light now. When she finally moved, it was to the back door. The porch light spilled weakly across the boards, casting long shadows through the screen. Diane stepped outside, the chill of the night air brushing her skin, grounding her. She sat on the old wicker chair, the one that creaked when you leaned too far back and stared out into the yard. She didn't cry, not yet. When Helen arrived later that evening, after Diane hadn't answered her texts or calls, she found her exactly like that, sitting on the porch, wrapped in her cardigan, her face hidden in the dim glow of the porch light. The air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass. Diane? Helen's voice was careful, soft. Diane didn't look at her. Her gaze stayed fixed on the yard, on nothing. He sees my death as debt relief, she said, her voice calm, steady. Helen froze in the doorway. The words hung between them like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to ignore. Diane, she began, stepping closer. What are you talking about? Diane finally turned her head. Her eyes looked distant, almost glassy. He said it. To her. Just now. My meds, my house. Sell sooner. She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. I've been living on borrowed time in my own home. Helen sat beside her, gripping the arm of the chair, searching for something to say. You can't take what he said at face value. Maybe he... Don't, Diane interrupted, voice trembling but firm. I've spent months pretending he didn't mean the things he said. Tonight, I heard him plan my absence like it was a spreadsheet. The two women sat there in silence. The wind stirred the trees, carrying the faint hum of a distant lawnmower, a dog barking down the street, ordinary sounds that made the moment feel even more unreal. Finally, Diane spoke again, quieter now. When I got sick, I thought he was scared for me. Turns out he was scared of the bills. Helen's hand found hers, cold and trembling. You're not alone, Diane, whatever you're thinking. But Diane stood abruptly, her face hardening. I'm not thinking. I'm done thinking. She took a step toward the door. Tomorrow, I'm going to make sure I'm not his problem anymore. Helen's breath caught. What does that mean? Diane didn't answer. Her hand was already on the door handle. That's when she saw him. Jason stood at the edge of the porch light's reach, half hidden in the dark, his expression unreadable. He'd been there long enough to hear something, maybe everything. For a brief, suspended second, their eyes met. No one spoke. Then Diane turned, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her with a soft but final click. Helen stayed frozen on the porch, staring into the shadows where Jason had been. But when she blinked, he was gone. Inside, Diane leaned against the closed door, the silence pressing in around her. Somewhere down the hall, the light from Jason's office still glowed faintly beneath the door. And in her mind, one sentence repeated like a curse. She's just a monthly expense now. The sentence that turned off the light. The kitchen table was cluttered with papers, bank statements, pension forms, medical bills, and Diane's eyes moved methodically over each document. She knew every line, every figure, every deduction. It was second nature to her now. She'd spent years tracking, organizing, and calculating. Now, as her fingers traced the edge of the life insurance policy, the familiar numbers felt cold. She lingered on the payout figure, thick red ink circling it, the amount Jason would be waiting for if things went the way he hoped. Diane's stomach twisted. He thinks this will fix everything. Her life reduced to a number, a transaction. But she wasn't about to let him have the satisfaction. Helen's voice broke through her thoughts, a sharp contrast to the silence. Then why let him carry the balance? Diane didn't look up from the table. He doesn't carry anything. I do. The words landed heavy in the air. She could feel Helen standing behind her, eyes narrowing with confusion, maybe concern. But Diane wasn't interested in justifying herself anymore. There was no need for explanation. She had carried everything for years. His debts, her illnesses, the house, the bills. She was the one who'd built the life they lived, not him. Helen waited, her presence soft but palpable. So you're just going to let him make plans without you? Without saying anything? Diane pushed the papers aside with one deliberate motion, her mind already a few steps ahead. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'm not letting him plan anything. I'm going to make sure I'm not his problem anymore. The words felt strange leaving her mouth, but they weren't a lie. She'd been planning this, longer than she'd let herself admit. The phone on the counter buzzed. Meeting with Mr. Geller, 2 p.m. Diane glanced at the reminder. She'd scheduled the appointment days ago. The early withdrawal, the restructuring. She wasn't just going to be a casualty of Jason's math. She was going to take control. Diane, please, Helen said softly, stepping closer. You don't have to do this alone. There are other ways. But Diane stood, taking a deep breath. There are no other ways. This is the only way. She gathered the papers, stacking them into a neat pile, her movements almost mechanical. The satisfaction of taking charge, of laying out her plan in black and white, settled over her like a shield. Helen's gaze never left her. You're really going to disappear? Diane paused, the weight of the question heavy in the room. Disappear. She'd thought about it, but this wasn't about disappearing. It was about something else entirely. I'm not disappearing, Helen, Diane said, her voice steady, calm. I'm just getting started. Helen opened her mouth to say something more, but Diane was already picking up the phone, dialing Mr. Geller's office. She spoke smoothly, her words deliberate, as if she'd rehearsed them in her head. Yes, I'd like to reschedule the meeting to 10 a.m. tomorrow. Early withdrawal and account restructuring. When she hung up, the finality of the click echoed through the kitchen. It was done. The first step of the plan had been set in motion. Helen looked at her, her face pale but her expression unreadable. There was no more pleading, no more arguments. Diane had made up her mind. You're really going through with this, Helen said quietly. Diane turned toward her, her expression resolute. Yes, I'm going through with this. It's my turn now. Helen didn't respond. She just stood there, watching as Diane picked up the manila envelope and slid the papers inside. There was no need for further explanation. Helen could see the resolve in her eyes. Diane reached the door, pausing for a moment. She glanced back at Helen, the soft light of the kitchen casting shadows across her face. Then, without another word, she stepped outside. Jason was out there, somewhere, thinking he'd figured it all out. But Diane had already written the last page of the story, and it wasn't going to be anything like what he expected. The doorbell rang, its echo vibrating through the house. Diane stood for a long moment in the hallway, her hand on the doorknob, as if waiting for something to stop her. But nothing did. She opened the door. Jason stood on the doorstep, his face unreadable. He wore a suit jacket, freshly pressed, the creases sharp like his intentions. In his hand, a folder, neatly stacked with spreadsheets, printouts, and a brochure for a long-term care facility. He stepped inside without a word, walking past her like it was any other day. He had no idea what was coming. Diane closed the door behind him, her steps measured as she followed him into the living room. The tension between them was thick, hanging in the air like the storm clouds that had started to gather outside. Jason set the folder down on the coffee table, arranging the papers with precision, as if this was still a negotiation he controlled, as if he didn't know he was already losing. "I've been going over the numbers," he began, his voice low, businesslike. "We need to make some decisions. Downsizing, starting with the house." He glanced at her, then back at the papers. "It's not a good time to sell, but pre-selling before the market shifts could." Diane didn't respond right away. She simply sat down across from him, her posture calm, collected. She wasn't giving him any leverage, not yet. "You want me to sell the house," Diane said, her voice steady. It wasn't a question, she already knew. "And go where?" Jason hesitated, flipping through the papers until he found the long-term care facility brochure. He passed it to her, his fingers brushing the edge of her hand as she took it. "Here, they have good programs for people in your condition." "I've done the research." Diane scanned the brochure, her gaze moving over the glossy pages of facilities and care plans. Her pulse remained steady, a calm that belied the storm inside her. She folded the brochure in half, the paper crinkling under her fingers. "I'll think about it," she said, placing it on the coffee table. Her voice was soft, but the finality in it made Jason falter. For the first time, he hesitated. He sat back in his chair, watching her carefully. "We can't keep putting this off. The longer we wait, the more complicated things get." Diane didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, eyes sharp and unreadable. The silence stretched between them, long and suffocating. Jason pushed a spreadsheet across the table toward her, but Diane didn't pick it up. Instead, she reached for the folder on the other side of the table, the one that had been quietly waiting for this moment. She slid it open with deliberate calmness, the creak of the paper loud in the quiet room. Her fingers skimmed over the pages until she found what she was looking for, her estate file, the one she'd been slowly and quietly altering. With a flick of her pen, she added his name to the removed beneficiaries list. Jason's words started to fade into the background as she signed her name next to the entry, her decision final and irrevocable. When she set the pen down, Jason was still talking, oblivious. "Diane, we can't keep stalling." She cut him off, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp as glass. "I've thought about it. You're not on the list anymore." Jason blinked, his expression faltering for the briefest moment before he quickly regained composure. He didn't understand. He never had. "I don't think you understand, Jason," Diane continued, her voice steady. "This isn't a negotiation anymore." The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. This was her plan, her future. The phone rang in the background, startling both of them. Diane looked down at the screen. Mr. Geller's name flashed across the display. She picked it up with an almost casual motion, as if she were in complete control of everything. "Yes," Diane said, her voice calm, unwavering. There was a pause, a soft murmur on the other end, then Geller's voice. "We can redirect everything, Diane. Quietly, permanently." Diane's lips curled into the faintest smile as she locked eyes with Jason, who had fallen into an unnerving silence. "Yes," she said again, softer this time. "Let's do it." Jason stared at her, the weight of her words beginning to sink in. He couldn't read her anymore, and that, more than anything, was the real loss. As she hung up the phone, Diane stood up and walked past him, her movements fluid, calm. She didn't look back, but she didn't need to. Jason had already been erased, and there was nothing he could do about it. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, spilling over the countertop in thin, golden stripes. Diane sat at the table, her laptop open in front of her, fingers hovering over the keys. The cool, steady click of the mouse echoed in the quiet room as she logged into the grocery store's account, the one Jason had always used for their monthly orders. She'd been the one to put the meals together, the one who kept the shopping lists. But he had always been the one to manage the payments, the subscriptions. The grocery account was the first on the list. She hovered over the cancel subscription button, her thumb trembling slightly as it hovered over the cursor. There was a moment, a beat, when doubt whispered in her ear, but it didn't last. She clicked the button. It was done. The confirmation page flashed up on the screen, the words "successfully canceled" standing out in bold, impersonal black text. Diane felt nothing at first, just the quiet hum of the computer. But as she closed the window, a flicker of something surged in her chest, a feeling that didn't quite register as relief, but something else. She moved on to the next task. One by one, she opened the financial accounts Jason had set up in her name. Auto payments for utilities, subscriptions to services she didn't need, old accounts she'd let him manage. With each click, she unraveled the last threads of what she'd let him control. It wasn't just bills, it was control. The control he'd held over her for years, shaping their world into something he could manage, manipulate. It had all been built on his terms, not hers. She cleared her credit cards, transferring the balances into a zero sum. Paid 6 months ahead on her utility bills, just to give herself some breathing room. There was satisfaction in the finality of it, each transaction severing the financial ties that had bound her, piece by piece. The phone buzzed on the counter. Diane picked it up, her gaze drifting over the numbers she'd just finished clearing, the decision still settling into her bones. It was Helen. "I just saw the grocery account," Helen's voice came through, soft but sharp. "What are you doing?" Diane's fingers drummed against the phone as she took a slow breath. "Canceling everything." "I see that," Helen said, the words catching somewhere between confusion and admiration. "But this isn't just exit planning. This is liberation." Diane leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the sprawling lawn, the neighborhood that had once felt like home. Now, it felt like a cage. She ran a hand through her hair, letting the weight of the last few days settle into her shoulders. "It's both," Diane replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not just leaving, I'm starting over." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Helen wasn't sure what to say, the gravity of Diane's words hanging between them. But Diane didn't need her validation anymore. She didn't need permission. "I'm going to reroute my mail," Diane continued, her tone softer now, but no less resolute. "A P.O. box. I need to sever every last link." She looked at the envelope on the counter, one of the few remaining pieces of paperwork left that tied her to her old life. It was addressed to her and Jason, a final notice on a debt that no longer mattered. She slid it into a drawer, out of sight, and focused on the task at hand. "I'll start transferring everything into a separate trust too," Diane said, her fingers moving as she clicked through account setups and trust creation forms online. She was setting up an account in her maiden name, a fresh identity, an alias to her new life. She could feel her pulse steadying as the digital transactions took place, the money slipping into the trust, making her future that much more secure. Helen's voice broke the stillness again. "Diane, you're really doing this. You're really disappearing." Diane didn't respond immediately. She reached for a folder she'd kept for years, filled with documents and reminders, things she'd pushed aside, things she'd once thought were too difficult to face. She pulled out the old ID, the one she hadn't looked at in a long time. Her maiden name, her old address, her history, staring back at her from the faded card. She held it in her palm for a long moment, the weight of it familiar but foreign at the same time. "I'm not disappearing, Helen," Diane said finally, her voice steady. "I'm creating a life that's mine." There was something final in the air as she dropped the ID into the drawer and clicked through the trust paperwork. Her fingerprints, her signature, a new identity all starting to form behind the screen. It was only a matter of time now. The phone buzzed again, this time with a reminder for her meeting with Mr. Geller. She'd set it for later that afternoon, finalizing the last of the estate matters, but she wasn't worried. She had the control now. Jason couldn't take it from her. Not anymore. Diane stood, closing the laptop with a soft click, as the sun shifted in the window and bathed the room in a quiet golden light. She wasn't just walking away from her past, she was erasing it. The office was quiet. Diane sat in the sleek, modern chair across from Mr. Geller, her hands folded in her lap, eyes steady on the stack of documents before her. The weight of what she was about to do settled over her, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt like the last piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The life insurance policy had always been a quiet anchor in the back of her mind. She could always rely on it if things went wrong. But things had gone wrong long ago. Jason had turned her security into a financial calculation. And now, she was turning it into something else. "I've reviewed everything," Geller said, his voice low and professional, though there was a note of hesitation as he slid the document toward her. "You're sure you want to cash out the policy early? There's a penalty for doing so." Diane's gaze didn't falter. "I'm sure." Geller paused, a thin line of concern crossing his features, but he didn't argue. He just nodded, pulling out the form that would allow her to access the payout. The penalty was steep, but it didn't matter. She had no use for the money if it meant Jason would get his hands on it. She didn't need the payout for herself anymore, but she needed it to be out of his reach. She signed her name, fluid, steady. A sharp click echoed in the room as she pressed the pen to the paper. It felt like a release, the final surrender of everything Jason thought he controlled. The documents were finalized quickly, her signature, her decisions, both irrevocable. The money would be routed to an account she'd set up for something else entirely, a non-profit housing initiative for single mothers. "Everything is in order," Geller said, the edge of the pen scraping across the last page. "This will be final. Jason legally cannot access a cent of it." Diane stood, the silence in the room heavier now, pressing in on her chest. She took the folder from him, the weight of the legal closure in her hand. It wasn't just a payout, it was peace, the kind Jason would never know. She didn't feel the sting of loss. She didn't feel regret. What she felt was the pull of something new. It had been too long since she had been free to make her own decisions. Now she was finally taking it. Back at home, the house was quieter than it had ever been. Diane moved through the rooms with a calmness she hadn't known she was capable of. She walked past the wedding china cabinet, its delicate glass doors reflecting the soft afternoon light. The pieces that had once symbolized a life built together now felt like relics of a past she'd chosen to leave behind. Helen arrived in the late afternoon, her presence solid, familiar. She stood beside Diane as they opened the china cabinet doors, the plates and cups gleaming softly in the sunlight. "We're donating it," Diane said, her voice steady but softer now. Helen's gaze lingered on the china, but she nodded without hesitation. "Of course, it's time." The delicate plates, the gold-edged cups, they felt like they belonged in a museum, not in the house Diane had fought so hard to escape. With Helen's help, they carefully wrapped each piece in newspaper, placing it in boxes marked for donation. Diane paused for a moment, looking down at the china she had once cherished, imagining it going to someone who could use it. The plates would hold new meals, new memories. She didn't need them, not anymore. As they finished, Diane moved to the safe in the study. She pulled out a small envelope, sealed tightly, and placed it inside. A letter she'd written for Jason, if he ever found it. She didn't know what he would feel when he read it, but that wasn't her concern anymore. She held the envelope in her hands for a moment, staring at the sealed words, before placing it with quiet finality in the safe. "If you're reading this," it began, "I've already made peace with being forgotten." Diane closed the safe with a soft click, locking away the last remnants of a life she no longer recognized. As Helen finished placing the last box of china in the car, Diane stood by the window, her gaze tracing the familiar streets, now seen through the lens of someone who was about to leave it all behind. She had done what needed to be done, and soon she would be gone. The cafe was quiet, the low hum of conversation a soft undercurrent to the clink of spoons against coffee cups. The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows, casting warm patches of light across the worn wooden tables. Diane sat by the window, her hands folded around a small cup of coffee, but her mind was somewhere else. somewhere she couldn't reach just yet. Callie had arrived early, as always. She walked in, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. The smile she wore so much like her mother's, bright but a little guarded. She spotted Diane right away, her eyes softening as she made her way to the table. They had always shared this quiet understanding, a bond between them that neither time nor distance had ever quite been able to erase. But today, Diane wasn't sure how to bridge the gap. She had been moving so quickly, making choices that felt like they'd been a long time coming. Now, there was this. Callie slid into the chair across from her, settling in with a sigh. Folding her arms on the table. There was a question in her eyes, but she didn't ask it immediately. They both knew she didn't need to. Diane took a sip of her coffee, her gaze drifting over the room, trying to find the words. But Callie was patient, her presence warm and steady. They had always been able to sit in silence, but now it felt like something unsaid was hanging between them. "You seem," Callie began, her voice careful, "done." The words cut through the quiet like a blade, but they weren't harsh, just observant. Diane's fingers tightened around her cup, and she took another slow sip before speaking. "I'm not done," Diane said, her voice steady but softened with a kind of finality. "I'm just finished giving." Callie's eyes searched Diane's face, looking for something she couldn't name, maybe an answer, maybe the reason why, for the first time in her life, Diane wasn't offering more. The grandmother who had always given, always been there, was now a version of herself that was empty, but not in a way that was sad. More like someone shedding the last pieces of armor they had left. "You're finished giving?" Callie echoed softly, her voice trailing off in disbelief. "What do you mean?" Diane leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup absently. There was so much she wanted to say, so much that she couldn't yet, so much that had to remain unspoken. But she reached for her bag, opening it slowly, deliberately. There was a small, worn paperback inside, something she'd picked up from a second-hand store just days before. She placed it on the table between them, her fingers lingering on the cover for a moment. Callie's eyes flickered to the book. It wasn't new. It was old, the pages yellowed, the cover cracked and faded. A used book, the kind that had been read and reread, passed from hand to hand. "I want you to have this," Diane said, her voice low. "I'll be gone soon, and I won't be around to explain things, but maybe this will help you understand." Callie looked at her, uncertainty in her eyes. She reached for the book, her fingers brushing Diane's hand briefly before pulling it toward her. "What's inside?" Diane didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward, her gaze steady on her granddaughter's face. "A letter," Diane said simply. "For you." Callie opened the book carefully, her eyes scanning the fragile pages, her breath catching in her throat when she found the letter folded inside. She pulled it out, unfolding it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. Diane's gaze never left her, watching her granddaughter read, watching her process the words. The cafe felt quieter now. Time seemed to stretch, bending around them as Callie read. There were tears in her eyes by the time she finished, her breath catching in a sob she couldn't hold back. She wiped her eyes quickly, not looking up at Diane yet. Diane remained silent, her own heart tight, knowing that this moment, this letter, would be the last bridge between them. Callie would carry this with her long after Diane was gone. The moment passed, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Callie looked up, her face flushed with emotion, her eyes red-rimmed. But she didn't speak immediately. She couldn't. Jason's voice shattered the fragile silence of the moment. "What did she say?" His voice was sharp, demanding, as he stood by the door, having arrived just in time to see the last exchange. His eyes flickered to Callie, then back to Diane. He knew something had happened. He could sense it. And he wanted answers. Callie's expression hardened, her hands clutching the letter tightly in her grip. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. "I'm not going to tell you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a decision made. Jason's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he saw something in Callie's face that made him pause, something he hadn't expected. But Callie had already made up her mind. Diane sat back in her chair, watching the tension ripple through the room like an invisible storm. Her heart swelled with an emotion she couldn't name, but she didn't need to explain it. Not now, not anymore. The doorbell rang just as Diane finished pouring the tea. The soft clink of porcelain on saucers, a delicate contrast to the thudding of her heart. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Jason's presence had a way of pressing against the air, a tension she couldn't escape. But today, it wasn't just Jason. There was Taryn too, of course. Diane made her way to the door slowly, each step deliberate, every motion practiced. She could hear them now, voices low and sharp, as if they had rehearsed what they were about to say. And when she opened the door, there they were, Jason standing rigid, his face unreadable, and Taryn beside him, arms crossed, eyes blazing with something that could only be described as entitlement. "You've got a lot of nerve, Diane," Taryn said, before Jason even had a chance to speak. She stepped into the house uninvited, her voice rising as she entered. "We had an agreement. That money was for the business. You promised you'd leave it to us." Diane stood in the doorway, unmoving, a quiet strength radiating from her. She had already anticipated this moment. She had already prepared herself. She wasn't the woman who had given everything without question anymore. "I never promised you anything," Diane replied, her voice calm, almost too calm. "You assumed it." Jason stepped forward then, his jaw tight, his gaze fierce. "You took the money we were counting on, Diane. We had plans. You're leaving us in the lurch, and you're doing it on purpose." His voice was low, venomous. She tilted her head slightly, her fingers curling around the teapot as she steadied herself. "Plans?" she repeated, her voice smooth but carrying an edge. "My legacy isn't your bridge loan, Jason." There it was, the truth of it. The words that had been buried under years of expectations and manipulations. Diane wasn't here to play their game anymore. The money wasn't theirs to claim. It was hers, and it was gone. Gone where it could do some good, away from their hands. Taryn's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a snarl. "You think this is about you? About what you want?" She laughed, but there was no joy in it, only frustration. "You're selfish. You didn't even give us a chance to fix it." Diane's gaze never wavered, her posture unwavering, the weight of her calmness almost more cutting than any argument could have been. She turned away without another word, setting the teapot down on the table. She lifted 2 cups, pouring the tea with practiced grace, the warmth of the steam rising in the air between them, filling the silence with something that didn't belong. "Would you like tea?" she asked. The question as simple as it was pointed. Jason's fist clenched, his breath shallow. "Don't change the subject. We need answers." Diane's eyes met his, steady, unflinching. "I gave you answers years ago," she said, her voice a soft thread of steel. "I gave you everything I could. And when that wasn't enough, I started taking it back." She set the teacup in front of him, not offering him milk or sugar. Just the steaming cup, as if this moment of mundane hospitality could soften the blow of what she'd just said. It wouldn't. He would never understand. Not now. Jason took a long breath, his temper flickering beneath the surface, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat down in one of the chairs across from her, his hands gripping the sides of the cup as though it might ground him. "You always knew how to twist things, Diane," he muttered, his voice low, raw with something he could no longer conceal. "You make everything look so clean, so simple, but we both know it's not. You've made sure of that." Diane folded her hands in her lap, her gaze never leaving his. "I've made sure of nothing. I've simply taken control of what was always mine." Her voice softened slightly, the calmness giving way to something deeper, something older. "It's my choice how I spend my last years. My choice what I leave behind. Not yours." Taryn stood stiffly, her face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. "You've taken everything," she said, a note of pleading creeping into her tone. "And for what? For what purpose, Diane? You were supposed to help us." "I didn't help you by enabling you," Diane replied softly, her gaze unwavering, her voice as still as the room. "You needed something I couldn't give you anymore, and it's time to stop pretending." They stood there for a long moment, the air between them thick with unresolved rage and disappointment. Jason clenched his jaw, fists still tight around the cup. Taryn's eyes flashed with something dark, but she said nothing. Without another word, Jason turned toward the door, his movements stiff and resentful. Taryn followed, casting one last glance over her shoulder at Diane before stepping outside, leaving the door to swing closed behind them with a faint thud. Helen, who had been standing in the hallway, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, stepped into the room as the silence settled. "You didn't owe them silence," Helen said quietly, her voice tinged with admiration. "But it looked good on you." Diane didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, gazing out at the view of the street beyond. Her house, her life, her choice. "Yes," Diane said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "It did." The documents were on her desk, spread out in neat, deliberate rows. Diane sat behind them, her posture poised, fingers resting lightly on the papers that had been delivered earlier that day. The faint scent of ink filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of the afternoon. The weight of the moment was still there, but it was different now. She wasn't waiting anymore. The challenge that had once seemed insurmountable was being reduced to nothing more than a few lines on paper, a signature, and the sound of a seal clicking into place. Mr. Geller had delivered the updated powers of attorney, the revised health evaluations, and the capacity assessments. Everything Jason had feared. Everything that made his petition irrelevant. She glanced down at the top sheet, the one with her name at the top, the one that had been signed and notarized just that morning. She passed the health review flawlessly. Her doctors had confirmed her mental and physical capacity, each diagnosis and statement meticulously documented. The assessment was solid, and every question had been answered with calm precision. The POA documents, signed without hesitation, handed the reins to her in every way that mattered. Jason had never expected this. He thought he could push her aside, manipulate her into submission, make her into a puppet. But she'd already taken the strings. She was in control. Diane took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the pen in her hand as she signed the final documents. There was something undeniably final about the movement, not just the sealing of the papers, but the moment of her own finality. Jason's attempts to discredit her had dissolved in ink. There was nothing left for him to fight. The sound of the doorbell rang through the house, but Diane didn't move. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was. The same person who'd arrived just in time for everything to fall apart. The same one who'd spent weeks trying to tear down the foundation Diane had rebuilt. Jason stood in the doorway, his face drawn with something between anger and frustration. But when he stepped inside, his movements were stiff, like a man who had already lost. Taryn followed, her expression a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. They had come to try one last time, but Diane knew better than to give them any more room to breathe in her space. "Diane," Jason said, his voice cold, the words barely escaping between clenched teeth. "You think this is over?" Diane didn't look up. She kept her focus on the papers before her, the weight of her pen a steady presence in her hand. "It is for you." Jason's face reddened. His fists clenched at his sides. "You can't just erase me like this. You can't—" "Actually, Jason," she interrupted, her voice as calm as it had been during every interaction they'd shared in the past few weeks. "I already did." She set the pen down, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. "Your petition has been thrown out. Your financial firm is distancing itself from you. You've lost everything you thought you had." Jason took a step forward, his eyes wild with rage, but Diane remained unmoved, her body steady as a rock. "This is not over," he spat, his voice hoarse with frustration. "I will make sure you regret this." Taryn stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won, Diane?" she said, almost mocking. "Some people rewrite history to cover guilt." Diane didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She simply returned her gaze to the papers in front of her, her fingers curling around the edges of the documents. "Do what you must, Taryn. It won't change the fact that your plans are over." Jason and Taryn stood there for a long moment, the tension between them palpable, but neither of them spoke. Finally, after a moment of silence that seemed to stretch forever, they turned and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind them, the quiet of the house settling back in like a slow exhale. Diane sat for a moment longer, her thoughts focused on the quiet victory she'd just won. It wasn't just the papers, the signatures, the legal victories. It was the finality of it all. Jason and Taryn had never understood the real power in Diane's hands. They thought it was about the money, but it had never been about the money. It was about control. And now, that control was firmly in her hands. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a notification flashing across the screen. She glanced at it, then at the door. There would be no more visits, no more confrontations, not from them. They had nothing left to take. Diane stood and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street, her mind already moving toward the future. The fight was over, and for the first time in years, she was free. But the phone buzzed again, pulling her back from her thoughts. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. The message was brief. Legal matter urgent. Call when available. Her pulse quickened for a moment, the sudden urgency pulling at her. She set the phone back down with a quiet breath. She would take her time with this one. She was no longer in a hurry. Whatever it was, she'd face it on her terms. The quiet was a familiar comfort now, the hum of the house echoing like the soft pulse of a steady heartbeat. Diane sat at the desk, her fingers poised over the keyboard, the cursor blinking patiently at the top of the document. It had taken weeks to reach this point, to finally confront the decision that had lingered like an unspoken word, but now it was time. The words would be simple, no fanfare, no elaborate tales. Her obituary. She hesitated only briefly, her mind clear. It wasn't a strange thought, or a morbid one. It was a decision. The final decision. Survive by quiet joy, sharp decisions, and no unresolved debts. The words felt final, but not cold. She wrote them down, letting the simplicity of it settle in. No mention of a legacy that had been stolen. No tears shed over the relationships that had withered away in the wake of years of manipulation. This would be her truth, concise and unburdened. She paused, reading over the sentence again. It was just the right amount of detachment, a reflection of who she was now, no longer tied to the expectations of others, not beholden to a past that had never been hers to carry. She typed the next part, hands steady. Diane Franklin, founder of the Quiet Ledger Foundation, whose work to support single mothers in need will continue to outlive her. She stared at the words, feeling something soft tug at the edges of her heart. This was her work. This was what mattered. No mention of family, no reference to Jason or Taryn, no obligation to explain herself to anyone. This was about what she had chosen to build, not the people who had tried to tear it down. She clicked the mouse, confirming the changes, then paused for a moment. There were a few final touches to add, a few last details to solidify before everything was set in motion. Diane reached for the folder on the corner of the desk, the one containing the contact information of the nonprofit leaders who had helped her form the foundation. She selected the letters she had already drafted for them, brief, direct, and clear. She would be remembered for this work, not for the people who had failed her. The letters were handwritten in her firm, distinct script, each one addressed to a different leader, a different advocate for women in need. She folded each one with care and placed them into separate envelopes, her heart quiet as she sealed them shut. Once that was done, she took a final look at the papers in front of her. Everything was falling into place. The foundation would continue. The legal documents were signed. Her name would live on in ways that mattered, not in ways that had been dictated by the whims of others. Diane opened her phone, quickly finding the name of the social worker she volunteered with. A woman she had grown to respect, someone who had always seen Diane for who she was and not for what others expected her to be. Diane made the change to her emergency contact, a clean break. Her ties to Jason and Taryn were severed. They would have no claim on her. As Diane placed the phone back on the desk, she took a long breath, feeling the weight of it all. The finality was settling in, but so was something else, a strange kind of peace. She had removed every tie, every obligation, every bit of baggage that had held her back for so long. She had cleared the path for herself. And now, for the first time in years, she could breathe freely. The house felt emptier somehow, the silence louder. But it wasn't the oppressive kind of quiet she had once feared. It was the silence of freedom. Diane stood and walked to the window, the soft light of the evening spilling across the yard. Everything was in place now. The obituary would be sent out when the time came. The letters would find their way to the right hands. Everything would unfold on her terms. For the first time in her life, Diane was truly free, and she was ready for whatever came next. The phone rang in the stillness of the house, its sharp trill slicing through the air. Diane hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering above the receiver. She hadn't expected this. She didn't want this, but it was the only thing left, wasn't it? Jason. Her eyes flickered to the screen. The name was unmistakable, Jason Franklin. The man who had tried to control her, twist her into something she wasn't. And now, with everything slipping from his grip, here he was. Diane exhaled slowly, steadying herself, and then she picked up. "Hello, Diane," Jason's voice came through, polished, too calm. He was masking something, though, something raw that only surfaced when he spoke her name. I wanted to check in." Diane leaned back in her chair, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. "Check in?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost too soft. "What do you mean? I'm just making sure you're all right," Jason said. His words were laced with tension, the politeness of a man trying to hide his true feelings. "You've made some changes, and I'm concerned. About your safety, your health. Are you lucid? Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. She felt the weight of the question in the air, but it was an absurd one, wasn't it? Jason, the man who had turned every shared moment into a transaction, now concerned for her well-being, as though that was something he had earned. "I'm still paying my own bills," Diane replied evenly, her voice laced with subtle defiance. "Still refusing yours." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Jason let out a long breath, a noise that could have been a sigh or a sharp exhale of frustration. "You don't have to do this," he said, the politeness slipping for just a moment, replaced by something more real. "You could still have everything. You could—" "Why are you doing this?" The question cracked through the air, louder now, a break in the careful composure he had been holding on to. There was no answer at first, just the sound of Jason breathing, his voice thick with something she could almost taste. "Why?" he repeated. And there was a pleading edge to it now, a desperation he could no longer hide. "After everything we've been through, why are you walking away from me? From us?" Diane felt a small shift in her chest, a tightening. There was a kind of sadness there, but not the kind Jason would recognize, not the kind he had ever been willing to see. It wasn't about him anymore. She set the phone down a little, resting her elbow on the desk as she spoke. Her voice quiet but steady. "Because I remember love, Jason, and I remember what it cost to misplace it." The words hung in the air for a moment, a silence thick with the weight of all the years they had spent together, the years he had spent taking. Diane could feel her pulse steady, the finality of the statement lingering between them. Jason was silent. He didn't answer. She could hear the shift in his breathing, the unspoken realization that the moment had passed, that it was too late. His grip had loosened, and Diane was already far beyond the reach of his manipulation. "I don't need you anymore," Diane said softly, but there was no venom in her voice, just truth. And with that, she hung up the phone. The click of the receiver felt final, like the closing of a door that had been left ajar for far too long. There was nothing left to say, no explanation to give. Jason was gone, just like the life she had shared with him. There was no fixing it. Diane sat for a moment, her hand still resting on the phone, her breath calm. The house was quieter now, but this silence wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that came with closure, with freedom. Nothing had been fixed, but nothing had to be. The doorbell rang, a soft, familiar sound that brought Diane to her feet almost instinctively. It wasn't the sharp, abrupt ring of someone with an agenda. It was the easy chime of someone who belonged. When she opened the door, Callie stood there, her smile bright but tempered with something quieter, something older than her years. She held out a small tin of tea, steam rising from the top, and a handmade scarf draped over her arm, the fibers soft. The colors warm. Diane's chest tightened at the sight. She'd known Callie could crochet, of course, but this, the simplicity, the care, felt like the embodiment of everything Diane had hoped she could pass on. "Hi, Grandma," Callie said, her voice calm, grounded. "I made you something." Diane took the items, her hands brushing Callie's for just a moment. "You didn't have to," she said, her voice catching unexpectedly. "I know," Callie replied, stepping inside without waiting for further invitation. "But I wanted to. I thought you'd like it." They didn't need words for a moment. Diane didn't try to hide the tear that slipped down her cheek, nor did Callie comment on it. She simply set the tea down on the table and unwrapped the scarf, letting the soft yarn unfold between her fingers, the delicate design a reflection of Callie's patience. She draped it over Diane's shoulders with a practiced ease, as though it were a ritual they had shared for years. "You taught me how to budget," Callie said after a beat, her hands still lingering on the scarf, adjusting it just so. "Now I'm learning how to protect peace." The words hung between them, heavy and true. Diane's throat tightened, the simple honesty of them almost more than she could bear. She nodded slowly, a small, appreciative gesture. She could feel the weight of the years between them, the knowledge, the understanding that had been passed down in quiet moments like this. But Callie was right. There was more to this life than calculations, more to it than simply surviving. Diane wiped her eyes quickly, but Callie had already noticed. Without another word, she settled beside Diane on the couch, pulling her legs underneath her as if they had done this 1,000 times. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft whisper of the tea steeping in the pot, the delicate clink of porcelain against the small wooden table. "I want to show you something," Diane said finally, her voice low but steady. She moved toward the filing cabinet that had been beside her desk for so many years, the one with all the donor files, the one she had meticulously organized over time. She opened it slowly, the rustle of paper familiar, the organized chaos inside comforting. "These are the people who believed in this cause, Callie," she said softly, pulling out a file that was thick with documents and notes. "They gave more than money. They gave trust. And I've protected it." Callie didn't speak right away. She simply looked at the files, at the names written neatly on each page, the signatures that seemed to carry so much more than the mere act of donation. Diane could see it, the same understanding in Callie's eyes that she had felt herself all those years ago. "This is your foundation, Grandma," Callie said quietly after a pause. "It's beautiful. They'll never understand. But I do." Diane felt the weight of those words in her chest, the depth of them sinking in like a stone finding the bottom of a clear pond. Her eyes blurred again with tears, tears that weren't just for the people who had taken, but for the ones who had given. For Callie, for the ones who truly saw. She reached out then, pulling Callie into an embrace, the warmth of the young woman's body a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't the same as when Callie was a child, sitting on her lap, asking questions, but it was still a kind of closeness, a kind of peace. "Then that's enough," Diane whispered against Callie's hair. "That's all I need." Callie held her tightly, the kind of embrace that spoke of understanding, of love that had been earned, not demanded. Diane could feel her granddaughter's heart beat beneath her fingers, steady, warm, unbroken. The quiet of the house settled around them, but it was different now. It was a quiet full of purpose. And Diane knew, as she let go, that Callie was the one who would carry this forward. Not Jason, not Taryn, not anyone else. The world outside could spin as it would, but inside this small house, Diane had found what she needed, and it was enough. Diane stared at the phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. The voicemail notification blinked at her, a faint, insistent buzz in the quiet of the room. She knew who it was without even needing to press play. Jason. She didn't need to hear his voice again, the pleading, the frustration. It was all too familiar. She had already made her decision. She hit delete without hesitation. The soft click of the message disappearing into nothingness felt like an echo fading from her life. No need for nostalgia. No need for explanation. That was the end of it. The silence that followed wasn't oppressive, though. It was a relief. She slid the phone onto the counter, her eyes lingering on it for a moment. And then, without another glance, she walked out of the room. Helen was waiting for her at the front door, a slight smile on her face, her eyes steady but gentle. The fresh autumn air beckoned, cool and crisp, as if it carried a new kind of promise. Diane didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. She knew what Helen had been quietly offering, space, freedom. The two of them walked in silence, their steps matching in a rhythm that spoke of years of understanding. The park was just a few blocks away, the trees beginning to turn, their leaves trembling as the wind nudged them into motion. They sat on a bench, watching as the branches swayed above them, the color of the leaves shifting from green to amber. Diane exhaled deeply, her gaze tracing the movement in the trees. "Grief doesn't visit when you say goodbye before the door closes," she said quietly, her voice almost lost to the wind. Helen looked at her, her expression soft. She didn't answer right away, just let the words hang between them for a moment. She had always known Diane to be someone who carried the weight of things, burdens both large and small. But this felt different. "You didn't burn the bridge," Helen said, her voice steady. "You just walked off it." Diane didn't respond, but the corner of her mouth twitched. She had no desire to look back now, no interest in what Jason or Taryn would say or do. They could keep their bridges. She had already crossed to something else entirely. They sat there for a while, watching the world turn in the park. The silence was heavy with unspoken things, but it was comfortable, like the kind of quiet that comes after a long conversation, where everything that needed to be said had already been said. After a while, Diane stood, her movements deliberate, as though she was shifting from one stage of her life into another. "I'm finalizing a small scholarship in Joe's name," she said, almost casually, though the words felt significant in the air between them. Helen nodded, her expression softening with the mention of Joe. Diane didn't need to explain. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about leaving something behind that was bigger than all the years they'd spent fighting and building. Diane had a way of making things matter when no one else had ever bothered to. "Joe would have been proud," Helen said quietly, though the words carried an emotional weight they both understood. Diane didn't answer immediately, but her chest felt lighter somehow. The knot of grief, the weight of all that had been unsaid between her and Joe, was starting to loosen. As they made their way back home, the evening settling in around them, Diane felt something she hadn't in years: peace. It wasn't the kind that came with medication or distraction. It was the kind that came with silence, the kind that settled into your bones when the words were simple, but they struck with the force of something pure. For a long time, Lillian couldn't move. She traced the ink lines, imagining the pauses, the erased mistakes, the way the pen might have hovered over the word sorry before pressing it down anyway. Finally, she folded the letter back into its envelope, pressed it to her chest, and let out a breath that trembled halfway to tears. Then she reached for her own stationery. "My dearest Ava, you don't owe me apologies. You don't owe me anything but a good life, one that belongs to you. People make choices that ripple through others, but you're not responsible for theirs. I never stopped loving you, not for a second. Keep reading, keep being kind, even when kindness feels small. And when someone calls you too quiet, smile. The loudest hearts don't always make the most noise. All my love, Grandma Lillian." She sealed the note and, after a long pause, opened the small jewelry box she hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a gold locket. Oval, simple, worn smooth by time. Her husband had given it to her the year Ryan was born. Inside was a photo, baby Ryan on one side, and Lillian and Richard on the other. She hesitated. Then she slipped the baby photo out and replaced it with a small pressed flower from her garden, a white rosebud she'd dried the summer Richard passed. She wrapped the necklace carefully, placed it in the envelope with her letter, and sent it certified mail. It felt right. It felt enough. 3 days later, a small box arrived on Lillian's doorstep. No return address. She carried it to the kitchen, set it on the counter, and opened it. Inside was the locket, untouched. The chain coiled like a question mark. Her letter sat folded beneath it, her handwriting pristine and unread. A single note was tucked inside in Stephanie's handwriting. "Please stop confusing my daughter. We don't need anything from you, no signature." Lillian read it twice, expression unreadable, then closed the lid and tied the box back shut with its original string. She placed it in the drawer beside her late husband's watch, another thing that had stopped keeping time long ago. She didn't cry. The ache had changed shape. It no longer needed release. That evening, she pulled out Ava's letter again, smoothing its creases with both palms. She read it once, then again. The innocence, the honesty. It deserved to live in the open, not buried under someone else's bitterness. She found an old photograph of Ava at 3 years old. Chubby cheeks, pigtails flying, laughing from the swing her grandfather had built. She slipped the picture and the letter into a frame, side by side, and placed it on the mantel above the fire. The paper caught the light, edges glowing soft gold. The words looked fragile but unbroken, like something that had survived a storm. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky cleared to a pale, endless blue. Lillian sat in her recliner, the framed letter visible from where she rested. For the first time, she felt something close to peace. Imperfect but real. The kind that doesn't erase pain, only puts it where it belongs. She whispered into the quiet. She'll find her way back someday. And in that stillness, it felt almost possible. The envelope was thick, legal grade, stamped in red. Notice of intent to challenge Will. Lillian found it propped against her door one morning, half covered by snow. She brought it inside, shook off the cold, and set it on the table. She didn't open it right away. She knew what it was. Across town, Stephanie must have been pacing, her rage now paper-bound, translated into legal language. The weapon of those who believed rules only applied when convenient. When Lillian finally slit the envelope, she found exactly what she expected. A formal petition claiming undue influence, mental impairment, and emotional coercion. It was the kind of accusation meant to sting, not succeed. She smiled faintly. The irony was almost elegant. After a lifetime of being told she was too controlled, too rational, her son's wife now accused her of madness. Lillian picked up the phone and called Craig. He answered on the second ring. "I was expecting this," he said, without preamble. "So was I," she replied. "I'll file a response today," Craig said. "Don't worry, their lawyer doesn't have a case. You've documented every transfer, every communication, every receipt for 10 years. Lillian's tone was calm. "And you'll make it clear they can't use my grief as leverage." "Already done," Craig said. "We'll let the evidence speak. It usually shouts." By noon, the paperwork was filed. Craig's paralegal sent her copies, meticulous, unshakable. Attached were medical records verifying her mental soundness, notarized witness statements from Elaine and the bank, and a full timeline of financial transactions that mapped every dollar she'd given, loaned, or forgiven. The file was clean, no ambiguity, no loopholes, just arithmetic. 10 years of proof, Craig had said once. If they try to fight you, they'll lose on math alone. And now they were losing on math, morality, and momentum. Stephanie's lawyer didn't last a week. The rumor reached Lillian through Elaine, who'd overheard someone talking in line at the market. Apparently, the woman quit after realizing she wasn't going to be paid, Elaine said, smirking over her cup of coffee. Stephanie's check bounced. Twice. "Poetic," Lillian murmured. "You think she'll stop now?" "She's running out of mirrors to blame," Lillian said. 3 days later, a letter from the court arrived, short, almost merciful in its brevity. The petition to challenge the estate of Lillian Hart is hereby dismissed without hearing. Documentation sufficient. Case closed. The signature beneath it was stamped, official, final. Lillian read it once, then folded the letter neatly and tucked it into her desk drawer beside the original will. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the paper, feeling its weight. A decade's worth of quiet endurance, reduced to a single paragraph that confirmed what she'd known all along. She had never been crazy. She had simply been kind to people who mistook kindness for weakness. That night, as the streetlights glowed against melting snow, her phone buzzed with one last message. "Ryan, we're not speaking to you again. No greeting, no punctuation, just the sentence. Blunt, exhausted, final." Lillian stared at the screen for a moment, then placed the phone face down on the table. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark Boise street, where her reflection met her gaze. "You never were," she whispered. The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded true. Outside, a single snowflake landed against the glass and melted instantly. It was a strange comfort, watching something disappear so quietly after falling so far. Elaine stopped by the next morning, newspaper in hand. You saw the ruling? Lillian nodded. Of course you did. Elaine grinned, dropping the paper on the table. You could have built a fortress out of that documentation. They tried to throw pebbles, and it bounced off stone. Lillian smiled faintly. Sometimes the best revenge is proof you never needed any. Elaine raised her coffee cup. To the unshakable, Lillian touched hers to it. To what comes after. When Elaine left, Lillian sat at her desk again, sunlight spilling over the framed letter from Ava. The paper glowed faintly, the ink a little faded now. She reached out, straightened the frame, and whispered, "This is what survives." Outside, the thaw had begun. Snow retreated in slow rivulets down the gutter, revealing green underneath. Lillian turned off her phone completely and set it in the drawer. It was time to let silence speak for her again, only now it was on her terms. The spring thaw came late that year. By the time the lilacs bloomed, Boise's streets had traded ice for puddles, and Lillian's world felt newly unburdened, quiet, solid, and hers. At Boise West Bank, her breath fogged faintly on the glass as she signed the last set of forms. The banker, a polite woman half her age, watched with careful curiosity as Lillian's pen glided across the dotted line. Just to confirm, the banker said, "You're transferring the entire life insurance policy to the Idaho Women's Literacy Endowment 15-year term." Lillian nodded. "Yes, every cent. The interest will keep the programs running long after I'm gone." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but the words carried weight. Each signature felt lighter than the one before, years of burden leaving through the tip of a pen. The banker smiled, soft but genuine. "You're doing something extraordinary," Lillian gave a faint shrug. "I'm just returning what was never truly mine to keep." When the final stamp hit the paper, she gathered her purse and gloves and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet earth and the promise of something growing. A week later, she and Elaine walked through the new Literacy Center, a modest red brick building downtown, humming with quiet life. Inside, walls gleamed with fresh paint. Tables held open workbooks and steaming coffee mugs. A young instructor guided a small group of women through a reading exercise, their voices halting but bright. Elaine stopped mid-hallway, blinking fast. This is what legacy looks like," Lillian smiled, the lines around her eyes softening. "They thought I'd go quietly. I just went somewhere better." On the wall near the entrance hung a bronze plaque already mounted in place. The Lillian Hart Literacy Fund, empowering women through words. Elaine reached out and touched the lettering. "You realize you're immortal now," Lillian laughed quietly. "Immortality's overrated. I'll settle for usefulness." They stood there in silence a moment longer, two old women in a building full of beginnings. That evening, back home, she found a small envelope in her mailbox. The return address was handwritten, Boise Literacy Center. Inside was a short letter on simple stationery. "Dear Mrs. Hart,